Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I am preaching this message today on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio program, broadcast out of our radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. Continuing in our study of the book of Exodus, we are in chapter 4, and I will begin the reading in verse 24. Exodus 4:24. And it came to pass, by the way, in the inn, that the Lord met him, speaking of Moses, and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet, and said, Surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So he let him go. Then she said, A bloody husband thou art, because of the circumcision. And the Lord said to Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went and met him in the mount of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord, who had sent him, and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spake all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their afflictions, they bowed their heads and worshipped. I'll end the reading there and try to preach about this. So last week we talked about Moses, after having been called of God and submitting to that call. He proceeds to get his permission from his father-in-law, Jethro, the high priest of Midian. And he gets that permission. He gathers up his wife and kids and starts heading towards Egypt, where God had sent them. And I mentioned that God did not say anything about bringing his wife and sons, but he did it. And I'm not sure that what we just read has to do with punishment for that or not, but it's always a good thing to check with God before we presumptuously take action. It could be that Moses had not checked with God whether or not he should take his wife. I think Moses is a family man. He loves his wife and his boys, and so he's naturally, if he's going to go and he trusts that God will deliver these people, he's just going to take them with him. But something does happen. Okay, and that's what we read about. And so he's taking them down there, and God's still speaking to him, and they're communing as friend and friend. He's telling them what he's going to say to Pharaoh, and what Pharaoh's going to do, and what Pharaoh's going to not do, and what he's eventually going to do. He says, I'm going to have to eventually slay Pharaoh's firstborn son, so that he will let my firstborn, namely the nation of Israel, let them go. Then it says, as we read, it came to pass, by the way, in the inn. Now that's just what that is doing, is that along the way to Egypt, they stop in an inn, like a hotel or a motel. I guess a motel, I don't know if there's a difference, but it seems like motels are just places where you can stay in our country that are just on the highways, that are on the way to somewhere else. Whereas hotels, a lot are like downtown in cities. That used to be a distinction. So motel, I guess, means like you're in a motor car, they used to call them a motor car, so you're in an automobile, you're traveling, you stop at a motel. Well, anyway, it's an inn. It's a traveler's inn. They stop. Moses and his wife and his two sons. And it says, it came to pass, by the way, in the inn, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Now there's a sudden change. I mean, he's just called Moses to do all this. He's told him what's going to happen. He's communing with his heart. It's like everything's going well. He's got Jethro's permission. He's taking his wife and his kids. He's going down. He's going to meet Aaron, he understands, on his way to deliver the people. And now, going into an inn, God meets him. And seeing he's beginning to kill him. From the best I can tell, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but from what I've read, it sounds as though he's just like enclosing him or like engulfing him. it's hard to, it's not clearly said. You know, some commentators said, well, it's an angel with a sword, but they don't know that. It's mysterious. Whether it says here it's God, the Lord met him. They just assume it's through the agency of an angel. But it could be the Lord. Certainly the Lord came into the world many times. He was in the world, the Bible reads in John chapter 1. That Jesus, the Word of God, was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world didn't know him. I think Jesus was with Daniel in the lion's den. I think Jesus was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. I think Jesus, I'm talking about before his name came, he was called the Word of God, the eternal God who ultimately becomes flesh and dwells among. He was in the world. I mean, it says it in that order. He was in the world. The world didn't know him. He comes into his own don't receive him. And then it says, and then later he was made flesh and dwelt among us. So before he took upon himself the nature of men, adding humanity to his divinity, becoming the singular God-man. The Father is God, but he's not the God-man. The Spirit is God, but he's not the God-man. Jesus is the only person of the Godhead who became flesh. But he was in the world, and the world was made by him, but the world did not know him. Though he was in the world. He met with Abraham before he brought destruction upon Sodom and Gomorrah. There's all kinds of instances. I think he was the Melchizedek who Abraham came and gave tithes to after the slaughter of the kings. He was in the world. Often the prophets, when they speak about him, they say, the word of God came unto me, saying. Now we always, I think, just assume that what that means is that like God spoke to me and I wrote. That many times he did. Sometimes it was a dream, sometimes it was a vision, sometimes it was just a voice. A still small voice like Elijah heard. But how do you know? It's not the same one that came and had dinner with Abraham before he had the angels destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It's entirely possible. He says, the word of the Lord came unto me saying, it's a person, pre-incarnate. Before he was made flesh, he was in the world. Though the world did not know it. The world, by and large, did not know or accept who he was. Nor was he trying to make himself known to the entire world. But he was in the world, and the world knew it not. So it came to pass that going into the inn, the Lord met him. That could easily be a pre-incarnate Christ as the angel of the Lord, or if you will, the messenger of God, because Christ is the messenger of God. And he's trying to kill him. I think if he was trying hard enough, he would have been dead. He could have just zapped him out of existence like he can us in any moment. And I'm good with that because he's given me promises of eternal life. I know that I'm going to survive death. We're all going to die, but God's people don't stay dead. The minute their body dies, the soul is gathered, the Bible teaches, by the angels and taken to the paradise of God. The thief on the cross, doubtless, was gathered by angels and taken to paradise, where he was with Christ the very day that they were both crucified to death. So, just say it. He could have killed Moses, and Moses still gone on to heaven. But he was mad at Moses. That's the point. He was angry with him over something. And we had no clue previous to this. It is kind of a mystery. But Moses had neglected to circumcise, I would say, probably one of his sons. Probably the younger one. Because it didn't say sons, it says son. But he had two sons at the time. He put his wife and sons, plural, on the donkey. But he sought to kill him because he had not circumcised one of those boys. Probably the younger one. I don't know if he thought he was too young, or with all the things that are going on, he just thought he'd wait till later. Now the law had not come, because when the law came, it came at Mount Sinai after he had delivered these people from bondage. It came to Moses on Mount Sinai. Nevertheless, God made a covenant with Moses' ancestor, Abraham, and he says, you, Abraham, you're going to have to circumcise the foreskin of your flesh, and that's a covenant between you and me. I'm going to do these great things for you, but the one thing you're going to do is circumcise the foreskin. And every descendant of yours will, every male descendant, and even servants, strangers that dwell with you must. I think that's the case. But certainly all descendants. And Moses had not done it. Now, if nothing else, this will teach us something. And that is, don't take God for granted. Don't take it for granted that even if you've been saved and you have assurances from God of eternal life, and there's certain sure assurances. Have no fear. I'm not afraid of going to hell. Never have been since I've been saved. I'm not afraid of dying. Never have been since I've been saved. But I'm afraid of the wrath of God, because he can really make life tough for you if you offend him. What he might do to you, what he might do to your children or to your wife. God takes things seriously, and we need to also. What he takes seriously is whether or not we obey him. That's a big thing to him. Now, why circumcision? Why is he upset because this surgery has not been performed on one of his sons? Well, what circumcision means, to the Jewish people, it's got to do with the death of the flesh, the death of the body, a part of the body. When they cut off the foreskin, they were to bury that foreskin as though with honor, I guess. Just like you don't just throw it in the garbage. Nowadays they probably do, but back then they were commanded to bury it. I mean, interesting. Don't you think that's interesting? They cut this foreskin off of a little infant. It's a tiny piece of flesh, but they bury it. But the point is, it symbolizes the death of the flesh. Now the flesh is still going to die. The body of the man is still going to die. You're going to die. I'm going to die. We're all going to die. Even if we're God's people, our flesh is going to die. But the foreskin being circumcised, it dies first, and it is typical, or it signifies the laying down of your physical life in submission to God, who through the Spirit adopts you into his household, or causes you to be born through the Spirit into his household. His seed, it says, remains in you, and you can't sin because you're born of God. It is still, I'm not saying that physical circumcision is required, because it certainly is not, at least not of Gentiles, I don't think of anybody. But there is a circumcision that is totally required to this day. That God will not bless the person who has not been thus circumcised. Now, circumcision in the beginning, obviously the foreskin, it talks about a male child. It had or a grown man in the case of Abraham and many of his servants. But that's a physical thing. And it's only men, because they're the only ones with foreskin. But now, this other circumcision, that's for all people. And even Moses spoke of it. We're going to turn aside and see this great sight. We need to understand, just like Moses turned aside to deal with something that was obviously special, and it was God. This is special. And you need to understand the significance. even though circumcision is done away with, and it says whoever is circumcised, they're a debtor to the whole law, that if you're circumcised in order to please God, Paul tells you that you are fallen from grace. In other words, you're looking to your works to save you rather than the grace of God, and it's a failure to think that way. That by physical activities you can save yourself, such as circumcising. But here Moses, way before Paul, way before Christ, 1,500 years before the Lord, Moses, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, he says, if I can find it now, yeah. We'll start in verse 12. Deuteronomy 10 verse 12, it says, and now, this is Moses speaking, and now, Israel, speaking to the whole nation, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? But to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord, his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. That's all that he's requiring from you. That's a lot when you think about keeping all of his commandments, which nobody ever did except Christ. No one perfectly kept that law. But that is what it requires of you. If you're going to be saved by works, is that you keep them all without any failure. Because the failure of one part of it breaks the whole thing, according to the New Testament. So someone had to do it. And the one that did it was Christ. He said, seek not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill them. One man had to fulfill all the law, and such a person, being perfect and blameless and without spot or blemish and no guile in his mouth, nothing's wrong with him, willingly offers himself as a sacrifice, a human sacrifice, to God on behalf of the rest of humanity. So that God's wrath against all of us was taken out on that one perfect man, Jesus Christ. A bloody death, a painful death, a hard death. But he died for us. A ransom, it says, meaning paying a price to set free all the rest of us. But his commandments, it says, and the first one of these is achievable if you're born again. It says he requires you to love him and serve him with all your heart and all your soul. When you get saved, you will love him because he places his love, he sheds it abroad in your heart, is what it says. Those are the terms that God hath shed abroad in our hearts, his love. So you will love him. And people try to make, they'll say, well, there's all these Greek words for love, and because they don't really have honest love for God, they try to excuse themselves by saying, well, it doesn't really mean love like you might love your child or love your spouse or your parents. It's an agape love. Well, it is agape love that it's talking about in the New Testament, but it's every bit as much as we have for everyone else, plus some. When you love God in the way that you must love him to be saved, it's with all your heart. All of it. Whereas sometimes I've loved my children, but anyway, not to the degree that I love the Lord. So, getting back to this, that's the true commandment. Like I had spoken before, it's, if you love God and your fellow man, that's keeping the whole law as far as God is concerned. So he says, Moses continues, but the heaven and the heaven of heavens is the Lord's thy God. So in other words, God owns everything in the heavens of heavens, I guess that's the heavenly places, and the earth also, with all that therein is. So he's reminding us that God is Lord over all things and is the owner of all things, having created all that there is, including you. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy 10, he says, only the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them. So even though he's ruler over all things, it puts a but in there, it says, or an only. But the Lord loved your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He loved them. He chose their seed after them. That he's meaning you. He chose you, the physical nation of Israel. Even you above all people. Physically, above all nations of the world at that time. Above all people, as it is this day. He's bringing it right up today. So he's saying, the Lord of heaven and earth, owning all things and ruling completely, supremely, above all that there is, loved your ancestors, and he chose your ancestors' progeny, meaning you, to set his honor upon you above all the nations of the earth. Now they're probably pretty pumped up with it. They're thinking, man, that is great. Just look at us. That's completely wrong. The things like that are a gift of God. Nothing to boast with. They haven't done a thing to deserve this favor. Just God chose to love them. And so all this favor falls upon them. But he says, I'll read that part again. Only the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you, above all people as it is this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. Now they had been commanded to circumcise the foreskin of their flesh. The boys had. Their parents had to do it for them. But he's saying, if you're interested in God in the eternal sense, not just in the sense of a nation and the blessings of God upon this nation, you need to put to death, because circumcision is death of the flesh, which the males had already done in their body. The physical foreskin had been removed. But he says, you need to circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Well, the heart does not have a foreskin, the physical heart. So it's not talking about your physical heart. It's talking about your spirit, the spirit that's within you. That part of you that is the you. You have a body, okay? But you're not the body. You are yourself. You're a spirit. There's a spirit within man that makes him different from the other animals. You are animal in the flesh, but you have a spirit, and therefore you are above the animals. And God set us above the animals. We're different. Totally unlike what all the liars in the colleges are teaching and have been doing for over 100 years now about evolving from lower life forms. That's a bunch of nonsense. God says so. You're made in the image of God, and God is love. And your fallen nature, as you're born to fallen parents, and it's been that way all the way back to Adam, who sinned in the garden, has a hardness about it. Your spirit is hard against God. It's just like something's got to give in order for you to come to God. And he's saying, cut it off. Cut off that body which separates you, your spirit, that humanity, as you were born, which is enmity against God. That's got to be put to death. Said another way, in New Testament terms, you got to crucify yourself. That's what Paul said of himself. He says, I am crucified with Christ. Now, Paul was never crucified physically, but here he is under inspiration of God telling us, 2,000 years later, reading what he said, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, though not I, but Christ liveth in me. He's saying his old spiritual nature, wherewith he was born a Hebrew of the Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day. He talks about all the Jewishness that was himself, and yet he persecuted God's people and was against Christ himself. A blasphemer and injurious. He actively fought, in his heart and his body, against God. And yet God had mercy upon him. And he called him to himself. And eventually Paul submitted himself, or Saul, submitted himself to God and was saved. I would say that means he eventually circumcised his heart. In other words, he put his old nature to death. He was circumcised with Christ. Crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, he lived. He died to this world. He died to the love of the world, to the love of his own self. He died to all those things that he might love God. And that's what's really, I know that's confusing if you're lost. It might be confusing if you're saved. I'm having some trouble telling you about it, but you must, according to Jesus, who knows all these things, of course, perfectly, and his words are just gold or diamonds to us. Every one of them is precious. He says, if you're going to come into God, you have to deny yourself. I think that means a circumcision of the heart. Because yourself is your spirit. You must deny or set aside your own personhood. You must deny yourself, he says, take up your cross, which means crucifixion. You must become dead to the world, which includes your own self. You must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Where did Jesus go after he resurrected? He ascended to the Father. He went to where God is. So that all holds true. If you want to be saved, you have to circumcise your heart. He says the foreskin of your heart. However you want to look at it, Moses was right. You have to give up on your own self. Inwardly, your heart has to do it. Your mind may think about it. Your prayers may be towards it, but ultimately, God has to matter to you more than you do. God has to matter to you more than you matter to yourself. You must have God. Eventually, at least with me, it reached a point where I didn't even want to live anymore if I could not have forgiveness from God. If I could not have that life which only he could give. I wanted to die, but I was afraid to, and rightly so. Because had I died in that lost state, I'd have gone straight to hell. I knew that dying physically would be a bad thing, but I no longer had a love of life. If I couldn't have the Lord, life meant nothing to me. I think that is what is meant when Moses said, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. By nature we are stiff-necked or stubborn against God. That's what that means, stubborn. See, God is doing all good things for us, but we're being stubborn. We love sin, and we love the world, we love ourselves. We don't love God. These things are common to all people. Everywhere. Liberia, America, Kentucky, Russia, all people, everywhere, of all ages, throughout time. By nature, we are enemies of God, stubborn in our rebellion against him. You may not think of yourself that way, but if you've not been saved, you're still that way. Because you have not submitted yourself to God. You have not crucified yourself to God. You have not circumcised the foreskin of your heart. As God commands, even in Deuteronomy, way back there 100 years ago when Moses wrote it. And he tells you why you should do it in verse 17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, mighty and terrible. See what he had done to Moses at that end? He was going to kill him. He's mighty, he's terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless, and he takes up the cause of the pitiful, and loveth the stranger, and giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I won't go on with that. I will turn to the New Testament text, where we're told the exact same thing, if I can find it really quickly, by Paul in the letter to the Romans. I already read you from chapter 2 about people who were hard in their hearts and despised the forbearance, the long-suffering of God, who didn't immediately punish them, so they thought they were getting away with him. But all they were doing is treasuring up hardness and impenitent hearts against a day of wrath in which God will utterly judge them. Well, just a few verses down in Romans 2, still keeping with this same Exodus thought, he says, for circumcision, talking about physical circumcision, it profits if you keep the law, but none of them kept it. But if thou be a breaker of the law, which they all were, circumcision is made uncircumcision. That's a little bit confusing to me, for sure. So here he talks about the circumcision of the heart. He says, for he is, this is verse 28 of Romans 2, for he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. Meaning the physical Jewish people are not Jews. That's what God says. I believe it. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. So the cutting away of the foreskin of the flesh is not true circumcision. That's what Moses was talking about that I just read you from Deuteronomy. The true circumcision is of the heart. So he says, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit. So we're not talking about the organ, but in the spirit, and not in the letter or the keeping of the law, whose praise is not of men, but of God. That means God praises them. What does that mean? God honors them. See how all that ties back to what we're reading in Exodus. God put an honor upon a stick. He put an honor upon Moses. He puts an honor upon everyone. He says, that seeks the honor that comes from God only, which I read you out of John chapter 5, which Jesus was saying, you can't be saved if you accept honor from men and never seek that honor which only comes from God. So that's why I'm saying that back in our text, he was going to kill Moses because he had not circumcised one of his sons. That means circumcision, which was a duty of men at that time, the physical duty of the children of Abraham, a physical covenant, a physical circumcision. But even though it's just physical, it was still commanded of God, and it was above all other laws that were to come. Apparently that was the deal breaker. He says if a man's not circumcised, he's not part of the Commonwealth of Israel. He's a stranger to you. Even your own son, if you don't circumcise him, he's not part of this group. Well, that's a picture of spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of the heart in the spirit, in which you die to the fleshly life spiritually. Your heart no longer cares about your life or your life in this world, in so much that it looks for the better country. It looks for the higher thing. It looks for the God that made it. And if you can't find that God, then what is the world to you? See how important spiritual circumcision is. Physical circumcision is irrelevant at this point because it's all been fulfilled in Christ. But spiritual circumcision is essentially, or it is a reference to being born again, which Jesus so clearly told Nicodemus, who came to him by night, that except a man be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. If a man be not born again, he cannot even see it or understand the kingdom of heaven. You understand the kingdoms of this world to some degree. You can't control them, but you understand them because you live in them. But you can't even begin to understand the kingdom of heaven until you're born into it. And then you begin to understand. Just like a babe, you begin to understand the things of God, the things of the world to come, the things that pertain to life everlasting. You cannot understand that if you have not been born again. Your heart has to be circumcised. So circumcision, even as a physical type, took on enough significance that God was prepared to kill Moses because he had not done it on one of his sons. And so what it says, and I need to finish this up real quick, it says that, got to turn back. So as God was engulfing them, I guess, it's like he was disappearing or something. He couldn't do a thing. It was too late for him to circumcise his son because God was seeking to kill him. Maybe in the process of it. His wife, Zipporah, took a sharp stone. What a terrible, painful way to be circumcised. A sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet. I think that means Moses' feet. And it said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. Now at first it sounds like, and some people believe it, that Zipporah is mad at Moses and she hates the covenant of circumcision. That could be true, but I doubt it. In the original, what it sounds more like is this. It should be properly translated. Let's see if I can get back to it. What she said was, a bridegroom of bloods thou art to me, would be a literal translation. A bridegroom of bloods. Now they were already married, but she was outside the commonwealth of Israel. She was a Midianite. She may have been saved, I don't know, but in the flesh she was not. She was a descendant of Abraham, but she was not through Isaac and Jacob. But what she's saying, I think here, is that not only am I married to you according to the laws of the world and in the eyes of God, but I've saved your life here by doing something that you should have done. And I am a believer in this bloody covenant of circumcision, whereby our son is part of the commonwealth of Israel and not a stranger to it. And you also, Moses, who neglected this, I've done it for you, and now the Lord is sparing you. That's how I read it. I could be wrong. But in any event, the thing was the Lord was going to kill him, and Zipporah stepped up, his wife, and circumcised the son then and there with, I guess, a piece of flint or something, just dreadful sounding. And it says, so God let him go. Then she said, again, a bloody husband because of the circumcision, meaning a bridegroom through circumcision. In other words, just where, in another place where it talks about Ruth and Naomi says to Ruth, who was a Moabitess, she was not a Jew, and all the men had died, and she said, you need to find you another husband, Ruth, and Ruth says, no, I want to stick with you. And Naomi said, no, I'm going back to Israel, and you're not of Israel. You need, and he says, no. She says, your God will be my God. Your people, my people. In other words, Ruth, in her heart, identified with Naomi, and she said, I'm going where you're going. I'm going to do what you do. I'm going to be what you are. And I think here Zipporah is saying, Moses, God has gotten a hold of you and he's sending you down there to do something important. And you neglected to circumcise. See, as the head of the household, it was Moses' job to do it. Even if he had his wife do it, doesn't matter. It was his job to see to it that it was done. It wasn't done. And so Zipporah is saying, you neglected it. But now I've entered into this covenant because I've done the thing. I have circumcised our son. I have shed his blood. I have put put to death the flesh so that he could be part of Israel. And she says, and I am marrying into that covenant. I am becoming part of this people that God is about to redeem out of slavery down in Egypt. Now, at this point, it doesn't say exactly, but at some point Moses sends her back to her father. And I think this is that point. Because later on, after they're delivered from Egypt and they're out in the wilderness, on the Sinai, the wilderness of sin, the Bible calls it, Jethro comes, her father, along with her and the boys and reunites them. I think Moses thinks better now. It's like he nearly didn't even make it to Egypt because God was going to kill him because of something in his family life that he neglected. It's just better to get my family from me. I think he probably sends them back to Jethro at this time because we don't read of them being in Egypt. We don't read that Zipporah was there or either of Moses' sons. I think this scared him enough. He just says, it's going to be tough enough, just thinking like a human. It's going to be tough enough as it is without added peril to my family. If God was going to kill me for that, I'd just assume them not be around when it happens. So he sends her home, is my thought, at this time. He does somewhere, it just doesn't specify at what time. We've got a few more minutes, and just verses 27 through 31 of the chapter 4. God fulfills what he said. He told him he's going to send Aaron to him and Moses. They meet together at the mountain of God, which is Horeb or Sinai or Hagar, whichever one you want to pronounce it, depending on language. Same mountain where God met him Moses met God at the burning bush. And the two of them get together, and Aaron, said to Aaron, go into the wilderness and meet Moses. And Aaron went and met him in the mount of God and kissed him. So he kisses his brother. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him and all the signs which he commanded. So he tells him everything about the burning bush and about his mission to go down there and bring the Israelite people out of bondage, and how he has to go to Pharaoh and demand their release. And it says, and Moses and Aaron went, gathered all the elders of the children of Israel together, and Aaron spoke all the words. He said, Aaron's going to speak, but I'm working through you. I'll tell you what to tell Aaron. Aaron's going to tell the people because he's eloquent, and you were worried about that. So Aaron spake all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people, meaning the signs of throwing the staff down, it becomes a snake, sticking his hand into his bosom and it comes out leprous, and he puts it back, it comes out clean. All the signs, it says, in front of the people, and the people believed. Now see, he said the people won't believe. God said they will, they're going to believe. And sure enough, they believed. The people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their afflictions, see, they've been crying out to the Lord in their suffering, and the Lord had heard. I tell you what, when you pray with all your heart for help from the Lord, and he finally comes on the scene and helps you, and you realize that without a doubt, God had heard your prayer and answered it. About all you can do is just break down and worship. And that's what they did. They bowed down their heads and they worshiped God. Now there's one more thing, I don't have time for it, but I'm going to back up to it next time I preach. Having to do with, I'll just tell you. He said in the King James, God's commandment to Pharaoh back in verse 23 was to let my son go, meaning Israel. He's my firstborn, let him go. But in the original text, it is send him forth. That's what God is telling Pharaoh. Send Israel out. In other words, by an official decree, you've got to send them out. You're not just going to turn a blind eye and let them go, like with a tacit permission. You're going to send them out. You're going to command them to go. He's going to so constrain Pharaoh that not only does he release them, but he commands them to leave. I don't know if there's a lot of difference in that, but it's worth noting because that's exactly what he does. He commands them to leave after Pharaoh's firstborn son dies. And God bless you. Next time. Bye.